Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, or release stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of films and the very fact that they get made. Now, what this particular episode is one of my special episodes, my occasional special episodes, where I bring in a filmmaker to talk about their body of work or a new release. And in this case, it is a new release at the time that I'm recording this, because I brought in writer-director James Gray, primarily to talk about his new film, Armageddon Time. Now, Armageddon Time stars Anne Hathaway, Banks Repeater, Jeremy Strong, Anthony Hopkins amongst its extensive ensemble, and it heads into UK cinemas just at the time that this podcast is dropping. Now, as you're about to hear, it's a coming-of-age story that's based deeply on James Gray's own life. I think the only thing you need to know heading into this interview, the only little bit that I throw in, is I mention a man called Phil Alden Robinson. Now, I've been talking to Phil Alden Robinson for an upcoming podcast special I'm doing on the film The Sum of All Fears, which will be released soon, and I just drop in something that he said as part of the conversation that we're having throughout this movie. You'll also hear me completely mess up who directed one film in particular. It was one of those utter brain freeze moments, but I think that's fair to leave that in. So without further ado, I'm going to set this up with just the start of the trailer for the movie, and then I'm going to take you straight into my conversation with James Gray. We met up in London, we were in the same room, and so the acoustics are slightly different, but hopefully this comes across well. I found him really, really fascinating man and a very considered interviewee. Let's see what you think. I'll play you that clip first.
The United States stands for an idea whose time is now.
Ronald Reagan will win tonight.
What a schmuck.
I think I want to be an artist when I grow up.
You're going to be an artist if you want to be. Nothing's going to stop you.
You're going to college.
He'll have dinner with kings if he plays his cards right.
I really like your stickers.
My stepbrother gave them to me. He's in the Air Force.
That's so cool.
How dare you! I'll menace to you!
Well, you're not to associate with him again.
What do you mean? Why?
I think you know what I mean.
My parents are sending me.
So that was a clip from Armageddon Time, the new film from writer-director James Gray. I'm delighted to be joined in person by James Gray today. James, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Nice to be here.
It is nice. Nice and in person as well. These feel very rare at the moment. I've been following your films ever since I got my copy of The Yards from play.com for £14.99, 25% off pre-order discount we used to have here in the UK. Those things are gone. But before coming to talk to you today, reading interviews that you've done over the years and articles written about your film, there's this phrase, it's just like, I see it related to lots of your films. They don't make films like this anymore. And I come to Armageddon Time, which is coming out through a major studio at a time when major studios were told are not interested in films like this. And I can't help but think you've managed to get something through that doesn't usually get through. And I wonder if you could just take us into the hows and the wherefores of that.
I mean, it was mostly the wonderful generosity of Donna Langley and Peter Kujawski at Universal and at Focus. I mean, usually you don't think you're going to just be sitting around thanking a corporation.
Yeah.
But I think they have a very long view. Because the idea really that you can only make one kind of movie is insane.
Yes.
I mean, even from a strictly capitalist point of view, I mean, if you went to eat at even like McDonald's, and the only thing you could eat at McDonald's was the Quarter Pounder. I mean, even their menu has choices.
Yeah.
So why this? I don't have anything against a comic book franchise movie. Some of them are excellent. Some of them can be made with great thrill and charm and wit and style. But it's like if you went to a museum and every painting was by Jackson Pollock. I love Jackson Pollock. His drip paintings are incredible. But imagine if every painting was a drip painting, you'd want to blow up the museum or something. So I think they had the vision really to say that we need to have a broad-based interest in the cinema.
Yeah.
And you have to make different kinds of movies.
The irony being there, I think the reason I heard of Jackson Pollock was the film, was it Robert Duvall wrote and directed?
That's Ed Harris.
That was Ed Harris.
That's right.
Got that through the system. I had a 1 in 2 shot in my head there. But that's how I know. That until then, I hadn't been exposed to his artwork or anything like that at all.
Yeah, no, it's they're connected because, with Pollock, with the drip paintings, which are 1948, 49, something like that, he really broke open the form. And with the cinema, we don't have that kind of experimentation allowed to us. So we have to subvert the system in other ways.
The name you mentioned a name there, Donna Langley, who he's come up a couple of times now in me talking to filmmakers who've got films through the system. I just wonder, can you just talk to her a little bit? Because we don't get that side of the story.
She has been very good to me. She's a remarkable person. I mean, she has the awareness, like I said, of the long-term investment in the motion picture business, that the slate cannot only be Fast and Furious and Jurassic Park. At some point, you're going to need to get older adults into the movie theater because that's the way that the motion picture industry remains relevant in the culture. Also, there's a lot of competition now for entertainment. I mean, back in 1947, before television became widespread, you had the cinema, which had air conditioning in it, and that was pretty much your choice. And that was it. Today you have not just television, but a gajillion channels. You have video games. People are connected to their computers practically. Their iPhones are in their hands all the time. And so how do you get people interested in the motion picture experience? Well, it's not going to be making only one kind of movie. Now, even in the moment, if Ms. Langley takes some hits, it's the long-term correct way to go. I'm convinced of it.
It's also the interesting part of the cinema problem, I think, at the moment, is quality of exhibition. It sounds like the most tedious little detail, but I'd moan the lack of curtains. I've been moaned like the moment where you sit down and the curtains come back now, and the feeling that you're about to have a show.
You're talking about one of the most treasured moments in all of art for me, which is the lights begin to dim and the curtain opens, because the potential at that moment is limitless. Now, the chances that you're going to watch a movie that is life-changing are extremely slim.
Yeah.
But they're not zero. And that could be the day that you see The Godfather. Yeah. That could be the day that you see Citizen Kane. And so that feeling of the show being presented to you was an extraordinary treasure.
Yeah. It was Christmas Eve, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was.
That's how I always looked at it.
No, I completely agree with you, and I really do. I do miss it. The other thing also is certainly true in the United States. There were a number of motion picture theater chains that were committed to what we might call movies for grown-ups, what they call upscale audiences, or whatever the term is. And they're gone. And it's not really the same to just put your film in another theater in a mall.
Yeah.
People are not sure how to take it, how to deal with it. It's a very different kind of movie experience. So I think that itself is also presenting a huge challenge.
I think also, I was in America, it was a little while ago, and looking at going to a multiplex and seeing what to see, and the grown-up films, inverted commas, they wanted to serve me dinner with.
Yeah,
I wanted to bring my food in while I was watching the film. It's just like, no.
Yeah, that's insane. I mean, you wonder if they're going to ask you if you want a newspaper or something, you know. Well, you would like to read the newspaper while you're watching the movie.
I mean, coming to Armageddon Time, which again, I cherish films that this was another Christmas Eve moment for me, because one of the things that I've done, and it goes against a little bit of what someone who writes about film should do, I think, is I've stopped watching trailers and I've stopped reading synopses. And so I go into films unarmed, if you will, and have no idea what I'm going to get at all. And your title just didn't give me a clue either. In this case, I did come to it completely cold. I found myself almost grateful for the kind of film that it is, because that I could lose myself into this slice of life of 1980s, but also the fact that you resisted nostalgia in the film that you wanted to say. And I just wondered, can you tell me what it was? Because this is part autobiographical, I've read afterwards, but I wonder if you can tell me what the spark was and why there was the drive to bring this particular project to the screen.
It was, but I'll tell you, trying to put into words why it is you choose the project you choose is not an easy question to answer. A lot of the times you're driven by a mood or a sense or a feeling that is a little bit difficult to verbalize.
Okay.
I had been telling stories to my children. They love them. They love the ones that I put a little moral lesson at the end of, and this one I couldn't do that. And I brought them back to my old childhood home, which they wanted to see. And of course it was smaller than I remembered, and there was very little evidence I'd ever been there. I mean, there was some paint on the wall where I had built my model rockets, but mostly there wasn't any evidence. And I realized, like all these people, thankfully, except for my brother, and at the time my father, who's since died, everybody in this house, my mother, my grandparents, my great-aunt, my great-aunt, all dead. Yeah. And they all these incredibly important family meetings were all these very big discussions and decisions, and they're all gone.
Yeah.
And so the film took on a kind of lost memory quality for me, where the images of that time are becoming a little bit dimmer. And I have trouble, for example, remembering my mother in a healthy state. And she died a few years after the picture takes place. And she's becoming a little dimmer to me.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I suppose this was an unconscious desire to reclaim them in my mind. And the other thing, of course, is how important I think 1980 is and was to what happened with American life.
And American politics.
Well, certainly, but also American culture. It was a very big sea change.
Yeah.
I think it was when, I had two big heroes growing up. I had Muhammad Ali and I had the Beatles, both of whom represented a kind of integrity to me. Ali, of course, was banned from boxing from 67 to 70. And the Beatles, they stopped touring to just record records. And there was no guarantee that would mean huge returns for them.
Yeah.
And, Muhammad Ali lost in humiliating fashion in 1980 for pretty much the last time. I think he fought one more time after that. And then John Lennon was killed in December. And so I felt that the 60s, but the 70s are sort of a hangover from the 60s. And finally that idealism of the 60s had drawn to a close.
Have you shown your children this film?
Yeah, I did, and they were deeply upset by it, actually. And in a moment of pretty bad parenting, I did not prep them for it.
Okay.
My eldest child particularly had an extremely strong reaction to it, in tears, because he had never seen his grandfather like that. It was a strange experience for him to see the grandfather he knew be a bit more complex than he had anticipated.
One of the things I've written down in my notes is it's a pretty forgotten 2015 animated film called Capture the Flag, which virtually no one's heard of, and it's not a film I particularly take a bullet for either, but I went through a phase when my children were younger. Whatever they said they wanted to see, I would take them to see. So we saw every animated film that came out for a period of time. Some were good, some were, let's not go there. But Capture the Flag was interesting to me. So I think it was a Spanish film that was just redubbed into English, and it's just like, it could have just been a screen filler. It's the only film I've taken my children to see that explores the relationship between a grandfather and a grandson. And I hadn't seen that done in such a compelling way until this film, until your film. And I was going to ask you specific to that about your relationship there. And I mean, when you're digging into your own life, is there a kind of document, a record almost that you're looking to put on screen?
My father was an inept photographer, but fortunately, he had no awareness of his own ineptitude, and so
I love that.
Well, it's a very chronicled childhood. There's thousands of pictures and so forth. But with my grandfather, I loved him. He told me that I was wanted, which is really a very important thing for a child.
It's
and
the
he
most
did
important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And he did something my parents did not. He asked me how I was doing, if I was all right.
Yeah.
My father, I think he had a very immediate desire and need to put food on the table, and a struggle financially that way. And my mother, the same way. It's almost like parenting was the second or third most important thing they had to do, not the first. And he was the one who sort of took me aside and said, "Are you all right?" But at the same time, what I tried to present in the film was not a kind of stereotyped old Jewish grandfather from New York, like, "Hello, my name is Moshe, and I'm talking like this," because that's not the way my grandfather was.
Yeah.
And it was a very complex relationship too, because it was a kind of cognitive dissonance that he gave me. On the one hand, I told your parents to do that. Your name is Graf. It's a better name. You can fit in. Fit in. The importance of fitting in.
Yeah.
And then the next scene, he can say, "Be a good guy. Stand up. Be a mensch. But fit in. But be a mensch. But fit in." And the kid it's not a mistake of screenwriting. That's who we are as people. We try to do both things at the same time, and it's not possible.
There's someone I worked for once upon a time came up with a lovely quote where he said he could perfectly well understand why grandparents and grandchildren get on because they have a common enemy.
Oh,
I just thought that was absolutely delightful.
Yes, I'd heard that too, and I think it's right. I mean, grandparents get to go home at the end of the day. And grandparents have done it already. There's a lot of advantages that they have. I don't blame my parents per se for some of their mistakes. I mean, Lord knows I'm a parent now. I'm sure I'm making my share. You just hope that your kid gets old enough. What's the joke? You want to raise children who are able to pay for their own analysis. But now it's the point where I just raise my kids so that I hope they can say to me, "Dad, you made this terrible mistake." And I can say, "Yes, I did, and I'm sorry."
Well, you capture a period in a young life as well where I think we just become aware that our parents aren't perfect, that they may still just about be our heroes, but the cracks are starting to come through. You don't look away from that.
No, you're quite right. I mean, in fact, I cast famous people as the parents for a reason, not just to get the movie made, although certainly it helped with that, but also because the parents are like gods to the boy.
Yeah.
And you look up to them and you say, "My God," you don't even think you'd ever be an adult. You think that, now that I'm an adult with my wife, I feel like we're playing house. I still don't feel like I'm a grown-up.
Yeah.
My parents feel like the eternal grown-ups. So I wanted them to be quasi-famous or famous people so that they would have weight to the boy and weight to us, because it's so much in his point of view.
Well, you don't present the character of the father as villainous.
I hope not.
No, he didn't come across as that. But what it meant to me, and I'm going deliberately detail light on the film because I want people to see it as coldly as I did, ideally, there's a moment where it goes almost horror-y. A bathroom sequence. I'm sure you know the one.
Of course.
Appreciating the cinematic influences on that particular sequence. But the fact that there's been a kind of underlying sheen of normality and bumpy normality to it really heightened that horror section, that when one of the characters just has a point of very high emotion, it just resonates an awful lot more than if I was just watching a standard horror film.
Well, one hopes. I mean, isn't that the investment of... That's the investment of character. See, horror films suffer generally from one of two disorders: a fantastical situation that you don't buy into, or if the situation is not incredible, you're usually faced with the banality of characterization and a clarity of intent. What do I mean by clarity of intent? Well, it's unclear is bad. In other words, vague is bad. When I don't know exactly what's happening, that's bad.
Yeah.
But when it's so clear that the ambiguities can finally emerge and people act in ways that you can't necessarily predict. You know, one of the great misfortunes about Ayn Rand's theories about objectivism and all of this kind of thing is the idea that people act out of self-interest, but in fact we don't. We act out of perceived desire, I think, and people are often doing things utterly self-destructive. And my parents were no different. You know, my parents were, it probably was totally counterproductive that my father would have raised his hand to me.
Yeah.
But he did it, and in fact, instead, all it did was push me away, not bring me back in line. But I was trying to convey the level of terror that I used to feel in the house. His way of, I suppose, maintaining order. But also, I don't blame my father for it, because at the same time, I think he was just inept. I don't think he knew what to do. He had a 12-year-old who was completely willful and obnoxious. What can you do with the boy?
Were you also overtly looking to explore the, just class?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a big deal. That's a big deal in the film. It's funny, you're one of the few people who's asked me about it. Particularly out of the United States, I don't think I got a single question about class.
Yeah.
But, we like to see ourselves as a class-free society, which is complete nonsense. But, of course, it's the major determinant, or one of the major determinants of what we might call our identity.
Yeah.
And part of it is that, you can be the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. And when your entire idea is, I'm going to get enough money someday to be X or Y, you're really saying that I'm willing to endure some measure of ethical or moral compromise in order to become a person of means. And that means you're willing to accept having your metaphorical foot on the character of Johnny's neck as you ascend the social and financial ladder.
It's also the expectation that comes with it. I found really interesting too. That if the positions of various, where people sit within class expectations.
Oh yeah, of course, and also the idea is that you can think you're at the top of the pyramid in one moment, and then you realize you're at the bottom. So the kid can think he's the president of the school. Mom, are you the president of the school? And he's all excited, and then he goes to the new school, and it's like, what's your parents' names?
Yeah.
And you realize he's at the bottom.
There's, I spoke to a writer a few years ago, Safra Mazur, and his story was put on screen in Gurinder Chadha's film Blinded by the Light.
Uh-huh.
One of the things that he said really just kind of knocked him sideways, because it was an autobiographical tale set in the 1980s, and he went in and he saw a recreation of his old room, and he saw someone playing his father, and he said it took a moment. It just winded him in a way that he hadn't seen coming. Did you have the same kind of visceral response when you saw parts of your life being built around you?
It's a great question. While I was shooting, I was taken over by the kind of nuts and bolts of what that means. Make the day, James. Is this a good shot? Is the acting solid here? Are they conveying something honest? But then when I got to the editing room and I saw the footage, because we shot maybe 90 feet from where I grew up, from my house. We shot in front of my public school, on my street where the movie theater was, Fresh Meadow Lane. I became almost heartbroken. It was almost unimaginably sad.
Yeah.
That it was the closest thing I'd ever have to a time machine. How I could reclaim something that was quite lost to me, and that is, of course, the past with all these people. That was a very melancholy feeling. Beautiful, though, in its way.
Was that with you right through the edit as well?
Yeah, it was, and it was also intensified because my father died 2 months into the edit of COVID.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, it is
I know
what
it
it is.
happens,
It's
but
life. Yeah, and he was pretty old, and I was on great terms with him. But when I lost him, the whole thing became ever more so like this melancholy home movie.
Yeah. Was your response then to watching that footage not a million miles away, if not for the same reason as that of your children?
No, my kids had a very different. They were really shaken in a way that I was not expecting.
Yeah.
Because it's like I said, they had a view, first of all, not just of their grandfather that they never had, but of their grandmother, whom they never knew because she died way before they were born. So it was the closest thing they could have into a window into the honest look at their own grandparents. And I didn't really prep them for it, and I think it was bad parenting on my part. But they were in tears when the film ended.
It sounds like you didn't prep yourself either, though.
Well, there's no amount of prep you can do like
I
that.
understand.
I mean, there's some work you can do. You talk to some shrink or something, but in the end, that's not going to bail you out.
Yeah.
And as a creative person, your job is to confront all of your demons and to put yourself into the work. It's not to act like you're above it or that the emotion doesn't matter. Emotion is all that matters.
Yeah. And there's no snobbery to your work either, I know.
Oh, God, I hope not.
Well, you make films about serious things, but not in an inaccessible way. And I'm assuming that's a very deliberate thing from your point of view.
It is, because you almost have to say, I'm going to be the Trojan horse. I'm going to give you a narrative which you can accept. Because I think narrative, this perfection of narrative, is a fantasy. But it's a necessary fantasy. You have to believe in it.
Yeah.
And if I give them that, and I give them a sort of, what's the expression, to sugarcoat the pill? So I was trying to sugarcoat the pill a little bit and say, this is what I see about injustice and disorder and the hierarchy, and I'm going to couch it in this way, in this story.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really all you can do.
And so as the storyteller and the filmmaker who's put your life into this project, as you have done before, does this part of it get any easier or any more enjoyable? The point of putting it out into the world where you don't have the space to reflect on it yourself? I mean, presumably you've been flown across the world talking to people with microphones like me.
It doesn't get any easier. In some ways, it gets harder.
Yeah.
It's you're growing sometimes, but sometimes you're not. I mean, if you're a student of the cinema, you know that it's very rare that a filmmaker's last movie is the best film. I mean, there are many who have peaked in their 70s. I mean, Kurosawa's Ron is an unmistakable masterwork by a person at the top.
Yeah.
But that's, for American cinema, that's actually, especially, it's very rare. Usually, we peak around my current age, somewhere around 50, 52, 53, or something like that. I mean, Hitchcock maybe a little later. I think he peaked in his early 60s. But the point is the same. We have about a 10 or 15-year window where we have to do our best work. And that is a daunting prospect because you realize that improvement, growth, does it get easier? All those questions. No. It's, the other problem is it's also like with movies is they're not widgetable.
Yeah.
Like studios, they want to turn it into a product that you recognize over and over. And they've been able to do it to some extent. I mean, I think certainly the multiple DC and Marvel movies are an attempt to make it sort of assembly line. The problem is that with a movie, if you're doing your due diligence, you're creating an entirely new thing every time out. It's like reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
So no matter how many movies you've directed, nothing will help you on day one of a new movie.
Can I ask you about being interviewed as well?
Sure.
And you're the first person I've spoken to since I've heard this, because I heard a podcast from about 7-8 years ago that had an actor on it, and he talked about going around junkets and being asked the same 5 or 6 questions. First of all,
well, that has not been the case for me.
Well, it's interesting. I spotted that because I've read lots of your interviews, and this is why I wanted to put it to you particularly, because your stories are going far beyond far beyond what you would normally expect of this kind of setup. But also the point that they made was they're more comfortable being asked those 6 questions because otherwise they're being given something on the spot that they have to respond to, and what they respond to might become the story that follows them around forever. I'm kind of wondering from your point of view where you sit on the being. I'm asking you about your life story, effectively.
I don't mind doing interviews if it helps people contextualize the work that you've done.
Yeah.
Although I do struggle with it because you hope that the film speaks for itself and you don't have to talk about it. Yeah. But it doesn't really work like that. You have to give people a context for what it is you've done. And I used to love it, but now I'm sort of sick of myself. I don't want to hear my name anymore. I don't want to see my name. I'm sick of me. Okay. And you're doing a lot of talking. You feel invariably like a blowhard,
But it's still aspects of storytelling, isn't it, to a degree?
It is, but let's just say without the grace and without the charm and the wit and the panache, it's a more primitive version.
I had a long chat earlier this week with Phil Alden Robinson, who's made a couple of films I absolutely adore. And I talked to him about making The Sum of All Fears, and the fact that a film didn't follow that. And he said to me that what he thought was going to happen was you do one for the studio and you could do one for you. That whole thing that had run through the 70s and 80s had kept going. And then obviously he came up against the fact that he couldn't get it going and he's not been able to get a film on. I'm wondering where you sit on that.
I have to tell you, I find that so hard. I mean, I'm sure he's not lying.
Yeah.
I find it so hard to believe in his case. Such a talented person. It's crazy to me. Yeah,
and such a quiet director who believes in silences as well.
Yeah.
Running right throughout his film. But you keep getting these films through. I mean, yours is a fascinating story, I believe, just because consistently you've been able to get these films over the line. I'm just wondering what it is for you, or do you see an element of you have to play the game a little bit to get the stories you want out?
Well, first and foremost, any situation like this demands that you be very lucky. So I've been very lucky. But I think also it does come down to, I have lots of flaws as a person, obviously.
As we all do,
Well, as we all do. But I do have grit. Yeah. I don't really care that people don't want to do it. I try to keep finding a way and pushing and pushing. And the other thing that's true is that I don't have multiple projects in a row. I sort of say I'm going to focus on getting this done. Now, if you were to look at my filmography, there are 6 and 7 year long periods in between when I make films.
Yeah.
And that comes from not willing to divide my attention with anything else and just be dogmatic and focused about getting this particular thing made. So I think that reaps benefits. Also, I'm able to get top-notch actors.
Yes.
And that really does help hugely. When you have great actors in your movie, some people take notice.
Interesting. And do you know what the next film we'll be seeing in 6-7 years' time is?
No, I hope it's not that long, or else I'll be broke. I don't know. I'm still sort of in this. I'm talking to you about this film, and I just finished it only about 6 weeks ago. I took it to Cannes, but it was a temp dub, a temp mix, all that, temporary picture. So I was, I really was behind the 8 ball and having to finish it, and I only finished it in late August, early September.
James Gray, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'm glad you finished it. And congratulations on the film. This has been a delight.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine. Thank you.
And that was my conversation with James Gray. Armageddon Time, at the point this is released, is now playing in UK cinemas. I think it's already out in the US as well. And that brings us to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories 2. If I've not bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. We're at store.filmstories.co.uk if you want to buy our magazines and our Blu-ray as well. And then you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew if you want to support this podcast in any way. Most important thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. I'm going to be back soon with your regular episode of Film Stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves, and bye-bye.